The year is 1943. The place is a converted schoolhouse near Busan, Korea, now a comfort station run by the Imperial Japanese military. A girl named Min-jun stands in a narrow hallway, listening to voices behind a thin wooden door. She is 17 years old. 3 weeks ago, she was promised work as a factory girl. Her mother needed the money. The hallway smells of disinfectant and something else, something she has no name for. The walls are rough, unpainted wood that splinters when she presses her palm against them. A single bulb hangs above her, casting a yellow, sick light. Somewhere in the building, she hears a woman crying. Not sobbing, something quieter. More like the sound of someone trying not to be heard. A sound so controlled it breaks your heart. A Japanese officer rounds the corner. He doesn't look at her face. He says a number, hers now, no longer her name, and points to one of the doors. Min-jun's feet move without her deciding. She has learned this in 3 weeks. Your body learns obedience faster than your mind learns despair. Inside the room, there is a narrow bed with white sheets, a small table, a basin of water. A mirror she avoids. On the wall, someone has scratched letters into the wood. Korean characters, old markings, prayers maybe, or names. She doesn't read them. Reading them would mean accepting that other women stood exactly where she stands now. That there were others. That there will be others after her. She hears footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots. The sound of a key in a lock. She knows what comes next, because it has come next every day since they brought her here. But knowing doesn't prepare you. Understanding doesn't make it stop. She closes her eyes and holds her breath, as if she can make herself disappear entirely, as if the girl named Min-jun is not really here at all. What she doesn't know yet, what none of the women in this building know, is that this moment, this breath she is holding, is part of something far larger than her own suffering. It is not the cruelty of one man or the misfortune of one girl. It is a system, a policy, an engine of violence that runs on the authority of an empire, sanctioned by military order, justified by propaganda, and normalized by bureaucracy. She is not a prisoner of war, not exactly. She is something that the Japanese military has invented a new word for, a comfort woman. And that invention, that category, that system, was designed to transform human beings into instruments of war. Behind the closed door, the sound of her own breathing is all that remains. Everything that happens next will be forgotten by history, recorded nowhere, buried under 70 years of silence, denial, and the slow weight of time. But it happened. It is happening. And the fuller story of why and how begins here, in the darkness of this room, in the moment before her agency ends. But Min-jun's story does not stand alone in the darkness. For decades, she and her experience were buried under official denial and deliberate forgetting. Then the survivors spoke. And when they did, the historical record erupted with documentation that proved this was not the invention of grievance, not a myth constructed by memory, but an organized, bureaucratic system of sexual slavery that operated under the direct authority of the Imperial Japanese military. Between 1932 and 1945, an estimated 200,000 women and girls, the majority of them Korean, were coerced, deceived, or forcibly recruited into what the Japanese military called comfort stations. These were not rest houses. They were facilities designed for systematic rape. The evidence is undeniable. Military records, declassified letters from soldiers, temple documents listing women transferred like inventory, testimony from survivors across occupied territories. In 1993, the Japanese government issued the Kono Statement, an official acknowledgement that the system existed and that coercion was involved. The United Nations has investigated. Historians have cross-referenced accounts with military records. The remains of comfort stations have been excavated. Every scrap of evidence converges on the same conclusion. This was not the chaos of war. This was policy, calculated, authorized. What you are about to hear is not speculation dressed as history. It is documented fact, drawn from the words of the women who lived it and the official records of those who organized it. Minjun is one of an estimated 200,000 stories. Most of those stories remain untold. Many of those women never survived to tell them, but enough survived, enough spoke, and their words, combined with the machinery of memory they left behind, the documents, the ruins, the letters, the silence itself, allow us to reconstruct what happened and why. The fuller story begins now. In 1932, when Minjun was still a child playing in the streets of Busan, the Imperial Japanese military faced a problem. They were expanding rapidly across East Asia. Millions of soldiers were stationed far from home, occupying hostile territories, fighting in brutal conditions. These soldiers were angry, traumatized, and isolated. And an isolated, angry military is a dangerous one, not just to the enemy, but to occupied civilian populations. In the first years of occupation in China and Korea, reports of mass rape by Japanese soldiers were becoming a strategic liability. Villages were being destroyed in revenge. Populations were turning against occupation instead of accepting it. The women were being murdered after assault, which created widows seeking vengeance, families demanding justice, communities in open revolt. The imperial military's solution was not to punish the soldiers or restrain them. It was to systematize the violence. If rape was going to happen anyway, and the military's own documents show this was the assumption, then it should happen in controlled locations, with recruited women, under military supervision. This way, the violence could be managed. The women could be isolated from the general population, reducing revenge killings and community outrage. The soldiers could be kept in a state of docile contentment, and the occupation could continue more smoothly. This was not cruelty born of passion. This was cruelty as administrative procedure. The system had a structure. At the top were the military command and government officials who authorized the program. Below them were local administrators, recruiters, and intermediaries, both Japanese and Korean collaborators who knew how to find vulnerable girls and women. The comfort stations themselves were run like military installations, buildings requisitioned from schools, temples, or brothels, organized into small rooms, supplied with bedding and contraceptives, subject to inspections and record-keeping. Some were standalone buildings, others were simply sections of larger military compounds, indistinguishable from supply depots except for the women locked inside. The recruitment methods varied. Some women were deceived, promised factory work or domestic service. Others were directly coerced by police or military personnel. In Korea, some were taken through the collaboration of local authorities. A girl like Minjun might be identified by a recruiter, approached with a promise, given a small advance payment to her family, creating a debt that could never be repaid, and transported to a station hundreds of kilometers away. Once there, she would be examined by a military doctor, given a number, assigned a room, and informed of her new duties. The term used was not enslaved or imprisoned. The official language called her a comfort woman, a term that suggested service, cooperation, even volunteer status. But what made this more than random abuse was its scale and its purpose. Between 1932 and 1945, the Japanese military established comfort stations in Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, Thailand, and other occupied territories. Thousands of these stations operated simultaneously. The military transported women in freight cars, allocated them like supplies in logistical records, tracked their productivity in reports, and when they became ill or were no longer useful, transferred or discarded them. This was not the result of individual officers acting in secret. This was institutional policy. There were regulations, memoranda, training for station managers, medical protocols, and accounting systems. A woman named Min Jun was not a victim of spontaneous cruelty. She was an output of a system designed by military planners who had calculated that her existence, her body, her suffering, was a necessary cost of maintaining their empire. Understanding this distinction is crucial, because it means that what happened to Min Jun was not an aberration. It was not the exception or the failure of restraint. It was the system working exactly as designed. For Min Jun, the system translated into a single room, a routine, and the slow erasure of everything she had been before. Her day began before dawn. A whistle, always a whistle, the same piercing sound that woke the entire station, cut through the darkness at 5:30 in the morning. There was no gradual waking. There was only the jolt, the immediate demand to be conscious and compliant. She would rise on a thin mattress, her body aching in ways she had learned not to name. The floor was cold. The room had no heat. She was given 15 minutes to wash using cold water from a basin. She was provided a thin cotton robe and told to keep herself presentable. The term was a mockery. What presentable really meant was available, docile, healthy enough to serve. A Japanese military doctor would come twice a week to inspect the women, examining them for signs of disease or pregnancy, both of which meant being sent to a separate facility, a death sentence by another name. These inspections were conducted without privacy, without gentleness, in front of other soldiers. The women learned quickly to show no emotion, no resistance, no sign of inner life. Breakfast was watery rice gruel and pickled vegetables. The portions were small and calculated, enough to keep them alive and functional, not enough to build strength or hope. Water was rationed. The women were told they could not leave the station except in the presence of guards. They could not write letters home. They could not speak freely to each other except during the brief hour before the evening customers arrived. Communication between the women was dangerous because it bred solidarity, and solidarity bred resistance. The Japanese managers understood this instinctively. A woman who spoke only to herself, who had no allies, was easier to control. In the afternoon, while waiting for the soldiers who would come at night, Min Jun shared a small common area with 5 other women. One of them was named Sun Hee, who had been at the station for 8 months. Sun Hee was 19. She had learned how to move through the hours without thinking, a skill that came with a cost. She barely spoke anymore, barely made eye contact, barely seemed to inhabit her own body. Another woman, older, named Ok-soon, had been there for 2 years. She still had some defiance left. She would hum old Korean songs under her breath when the guards were distracted. Songs about home and family, songs that made some of the younger women cry and others burn with a rage they could not express. But Ok-soon's defiance had limits. When a guard heard her singing and reported it, she was locked in solitary confinement for 3 days, given no food except rice and salt. When she emerged, she no longer hummed. The lesson was clear. Any assertion of identity, any act that placed memory or culture above obedience would be punished. The women's Korean names had been replaced with Japanese ones. Min Jun became Yoshiko. Sun Hee became Sachiko. This was not incidental. It was deliberate. The removal of a name is the removal of ancestry, family, history. To be called by a Japanese name was to be slowly severed from everything that made you Korean. everything that made you human in the way you understood humanity. The evenings were the purpose of everything. From 7 p.m. until late night, soldiers would come, sometimes 5 or 6 in a single night, sometimes more on weekends. There were no refusals permitted. Illness was not an excuse. Resistance meant punishment. The women were expected to smile, to appear willing, to perform gratitude. The pretense of consent was part of the system. In official documents, comfort women were sometimes called volunteers. In reality, they were imprisoned. They had no choice about which men came to their room, no choice about what was done to them, no choice about anything. The violence was systematic and utterly normalized. Many of the soldiers seemed to view the women not as human beings but as equipment, machines designed to absorb their rage, their loneliness, their power. After each man left, there was no time for processing, no time for grief or shock or recovery. There was only the next man, or, if there was a break, the task of cleaning, of preparing the room again, of rendering yourself presentable once more. The women were given harsh soap and rationed water to wash. If they became pregnant, and many did, they were given injections that were sometimes miscarriages, sometimes simply poisons. If they contracted venereal disease, they were segregated until they either recovered or died. If they tried to escape, they were beaten and brought back. What the system achieved, across thousands of stations and hundreds of thousands of women, was the transformation of human beings into a category that existed outside of law, outside of humanity, outside of history itself. These were women who were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, present in the beds of soldiers, invisible in the official records, forgotten in the aftermath of war. Every night, in her small room, Minjun learned a terrible truth: that a person can be systematically destroyed while remaining alive. But the violation was not limited to the privacy of individual rooms. What made the comfort station system so effective as a tool of domination was its public dimension. Ritualized degradation, designed to reinforce complete ownership of the women's bodies and will. Weekly inspections lined them up, partially undressed, examined in front of soldiers and staff. But these were only the beginning. Officers organized what they called special events, gatherings where multiple soldiers rotated through in rapid succession, where women were required to parade before groups in military camps, activities calculated purely to maximize humiliation and establish hierarchy. Some women were forced to watch what happened to others who had tried to refuse. The message was always the same. Any assertion of humanity would be met with demonstration. The intent was not just violation, but transformation, reducing a human being to less than an object, to something shameful and contaminated, something that had no worth beyond this moment. Minjun experienced these rituals, and with each one, something inside her calcified. Her ability to feel shock diminished. Her sense of her own worth became abstract, something she could no longer quite access. But there came a night, about 4 months into her captivity, when something broke open instead of closing. A soldier came to her room, and instead of the numb compliance she had learned, she refused. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat on the edge of her bed and said, "No." The word was barely audible, but it was clear. No. The consequences were immediate and severe. She was removed from her room and placed in a small isolation cell with no light, no bedding, nothing but a bucket. She was given minimal food. For 2 days she remained there. But worse than the physical punishment was the message from other women when she was returned to her station. Look what happens when you refuse. The women who could still feel fear watched her, and the message circulated through the station's nervous system like a poison. But Minjun's refusal, though broken, was not unique. Other women in other stations made similar choices. Some scratched messages into walls, Korean words, the names of their families, dates, prayers. These inscriptions, when discovered, were sometimes painted over immediately. Sometimes they were left as warnings to new arrivals about what would happen if they, too, attempted to carve out a space that was theirs. One woman in a station in the Philippines spent 3 years teaching other women literacy in whispered lessons during the few minutes they were unsupervised, believing that if they could read and write, they could preserve some part of themselves that the system could not touch. Another woman in Busan organized a silent resistance, a refusal to acknowledge the Japanese guards with eye contact or nods, a tiny assertion that they did not exist, that their authority was not real. She was beaten, but the gesture spread, and for a brief period, the women moved through the station like ghosts, unseeing and unseen. These acts of resistance, small, quiet, ineffective at stopping the system, but real, came from a place of desperate mathematics. The women understood that they had already lost their bodies, their futures, their families, their names. All that remained was something that could not be taken: the refusal to believe they deserved what was happening to them. To resist was not to change their circumstances. To resist was to maintain, in the smallest possible way, that they were not guilty of their own destruction. They were the victims of a system designed to make them complicit in their own annihilation. And resistance, even pointless resistance, was the only way to say, "No, I do not accept this logic. You have taken everything, but you have not taken my refusal." But Minjun's refusal, and the refusals of thousands of women like her, changed nothing about the system itself. The machine continued operating. Soldiers continued coming. Women continued disappearing into comfort stations across occupied territories. The imperial military did not pause. It did not reconsider. It did not implement reforms or release those imprisoned. If anything, as the war turned against Japan and resources became scarcer, conditions at some stations worsened. The women were moved less frequently to new stations. They were given even less food. Some were simply left behind when stations were evacuated, with no transportation home, no documentation of what had happened to them. When Japan's surrender came in August 1945, the comfort women were not liberated into safety or justice. What came next was erasure. The Japanese military issued orders to destroy records. Station managers were told to cover their tracks. Some women were released, but abandoned in foreign countries with no money, no documentation, no way to return home. Others were killed to eliminate witnesses. The soldiers and officers who had run the stations scattered into civilian life. No one was tried for running a comfort station. No one was prosecuted specifically for sexual slavery. The trials that did occur, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which prosecuted Japanese war crimes, focused on battles, strategy, and conventional war crimes. The sexual enslavement of 200,000 women was treated as an incidental detail, if it was mentioned at all. For nearly 50 years, the system was buried. The women who survived returned to their countries as damaged, unmarked refugees. In Korea, some were rejected by their own families and communities because of the stigma attached to what had happened to them. They were not heroes or victims in any honorable sense. They were contaminated, fallen women. The shame the system had designed them to feel became the final victory of that system. Silence spread like a second occupation. The women who had lived through it were isolated, aging, and disappearing. The world moved on. It was not until the 1990s, nearly half a century later, that survivors began to speak publicly. A woman named Kim Hak-sun testified in 1991. Then others followed, and their testimonies cracked open the historical silence. In 1993, under international pressure, the Japanese government issued the Kono Statement, an official acknowledgement that the system existed and that coercion was involved. But the statement was limited, carefully worded, and followed by decades of politicians in Japan attempting to walk it back, redefine coercion, or deny its historical accuracy altogether. In 2015, a Japanese government office issued a statement saying the Kono Statement had not been based on adequate evidence, a position that directly contradicted the testimony of survivors and the documentary record itself. Other attempts at official recognition proved equally hollow. In 2015, Japan and South Korea signed an agreement acknowledging the suffering of comfort women and establishing a fund for survivors. But the fund came with conditions. Survivors had to accept the framing as a resolution, and South Korea had to agree to stop bringing up the issue in the international arena. It was a settlement designed not to heal or restore justice, but to silence. The living survivors, by then mostly elderly women in their 80s and 90s, received money that could not restore their stolen years, could not undo their isolation, could not repair what had been destroyed. What remained was the same architecture of power that had created the system in the first place. Japan's refusal to fully acknowledge the comfort women's system, the continued denial by some officials, the attempts to minimize the number of victims or the degree of coercion, these were not separate from the original crime. They were a continuation of it. The women had been erased from history once, through the destruction of records and the fog of war. Now they were being erased again, through official minimization and strategic forgetting. The system had ended, but its logic, the logic that some women's suffering doesn't matter, that the victors get to decide what happened, that inconvenient truths can be buried if you wait long enough, persisted. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. The comfort women's system is not ancient history. Some survivors are still alive. Walk through Busan today and you will find memorials, statues, plaques, gardens of remembrance. But how many tourists who pass them know what they commemorate? Most move on unseeing. They take photos. The memorials exist, but they exist in a world of official denials, diplomatic silence, and documents that remain classified. The women are remembered by monuments tourists do not understand, their stories told in museums few visit, their voices on recordings younger generations rarely hear. This is the true architecture of erasure. Not the destruction of records alone, but their burial beneath layers of silence. Not the death of survivors, but the slow transformation of their testimony into background noise. Something that can be acknowledged without being truly confronted. The comfort women's system was not an isolated atrocity. It was a civilized nation, an empire, with educated elites, with bureaucrats and engineers and doctors, systematically transforming human beings into consumables. And that same logic persists. In our time, sexual trafficking affects millions of women worldwide. The equation remains unchanged. Power plus vulnerability equals systematic violation, then official denial. The uniforms are different, the bureaucracy is subtler, but the machinery operates on the same principle, that some lives are expendable, that poverty makes women available as resources, that profit justifies exploitation. If we forget the comfort women, if we bury their stories under silence and strategic doubt, we are not simply failing the past. We are signing a permission slip for the future. But if we remember, if we insist on remembering, if we teach these stories to those who come after us, if we hold institutions accountable for the truth of what they have done, we might, at least, make it harder for such systems to operate in darkness. The question is not whether these stories happened. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether we have the courage to look directly at what we have learned about ourselves, our nations, our civilizations. To understand that the line between order and atrocity is not as wide as we like to believe. Minjun survived. She returned to Korea in 1946, one of the thousands of survivors. She lived for another 70 years, most of them in silence. She finally spoke publicly in the early 2000s, when she was already an old woman, when the world was ready, or perhaps was forced, to listen. She died in 2010, taking with her the details of her imprisonment that she could never quite put into words. But her silence, too, was part of the testimony. The way her life was fractured by what happened to her, the way she could never quite belong anywhere, the way she raised her children with a wound she could never explain, this, too, is history. 80 years have passed since Minjun first heard that whistle at dawn. 80 years, and the women are still fighting to be remembered, still fighting against the machinery of forgetting. The question is not whether these stories happened. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether we have the courage to look directly at what we have learned about ourselves, our nations, our civilizations, to see that we are capable of such things, to understand that the line between order and atrocity is not as wide as we like to believe, and to recognize that forgetting, in the end, is just another form of violence.